Yeah, well, that's a good idea.
Hey Jeff, I said to Pete, I can't believe Jeff is moving. He's gonna miss Tuesday night candy. She said, send it to him.
Welcome, everybody, to the study session of March 28th. Why don't we do a roll call, please?
I will. Councilmember Bode is absent this evening, so we'll start with Councilmember Sherman. Here. Councilmember Gutierrez.
Here.
Marinesco.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Schmidt.
Here.
Councilmember McDowell
Present.
and Councilmember Peterson.
Here.
Thank you, Donna.
You're welcome.
Finance Director Mike Givens has information for us about business license and B&O taxes.
Thank you, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and members of council. We're bringing you a study session tonight surrounding the topics of business licenses and business and occupation tax, with some questions that have come to us recently so that you can consider it and perhaps give us some direction if you want to see any changes in the future, but we're not recommending any changes to either code or B&O tax rates. I want to state that through this study session, but rather to see if you want to have us look at some clarification to language. So the city managers and I will be presenting you with some information, and feel free to ask questions. This topic, as I work with it more and more as we answer questions, sometimes there's more questions than answers with this as to what's covered, as you well know. So with that, I'm going to start with really what it means to conduct business in Washington state. So the state of Washington has rules that most individuals or companies that conduct business in our state have to obtain a state business license from BLS. Also, then cities also require a separate business license. As you know, in Shelton, we require that. This is perhaps, there it is, an image off of the licensing website, where it requires and states on here that we require a business license for any reported gross annual income over 2,000. Sometimes, I know you've been updated, sometimes we get questions, well, what's the enforcement on that? How do you follow through on that? There's not much enforcement that we have right now. As you're aware, we had some very outdated software that the city was using. We're in the process of getting that updated. That will allow us to do some more checking, but it's still not going to necessarily identify a business that's not licensed, but it will help us to follow up on businesses that maybe haven't renewed and that sort of thing in a more efficient way than we have. But we are still in the process of getting that software up and running, but it will be far better than the outdated software that we have now. So one of the issues that comes to us is through this model ordinance that the state of Washington provides. And what I found is most cities follow that model ordinance that was provided to them. So most of us are just going along with that kind of language in our ordinance. So engaging in business, that definition is commencing, conducting, or continuing in business, and also the exercise of corporate or franchise powers, as well as liquidating a business when the liquidators thereof hold themselves out to the public as conducting such business. So one of the reasons we're talking about this is it came to our attention through a question this winter. Well, what is a business and do I need a license? And so that is kind of surrounding, I think, the first part of the question. The section sets forth examples of activities that constitute engaging in business. The activities listed in this section are illustrative only and are not intended to narrow the definition of engaging in business. So and the model ordinance goes down as well does ours about what kinds of activities constitute a business. So one of the, I think, real questions that came to us was surrounding, if I own this property and I lease it out, am I in a business? And in doing some research, we found that some cities qualify how much you have to own to really be in, or lease or rent and be in a business. We don't really specify that. So one of the questions came by a person is, do I need to get a business license if I'm leasing out this land, for example? And so owning, renting, leasing, maintaining, or having the right to use or using tangible personal property, intangible personal property, or real property permanently or temporarily located in the city, and then owning, renting, leasing, using, or maintaining an office, place of business, or other establishment in the city. And the Bureau of Licensing and Department of Revenue give us some more complicated rules on rentals or leases. And they state that a rental, they really distinguish between rental versus license to use. And so where this comes down to, for me, being a big kind of a question, are some of the examples that they give. B&O tax under the service and other activities classification applies to licenses granting use of a portion of a building owned by another to conduct a separate business. And they give a couple of examples. A barber or beautician might use a portion of a barber shop or beauty salon owned by another. A lawyer might use an office in a building owned by another. A food vendor might operate a lunch counter in a drugstore owned by another. There is no tax if the agreement between the barber, beautician, lawyer, or food vendor and the building owner is a lease or rental of real property, as opposed to a mere license to use. So when you start looking at this, it gets even more complex, because then that question comes back to us. Well, if I'm owning this particular piece of property, then am I in a business if I lease it out? And then how much constitutes the business? Am I capturing that right? That came to us, Jeff?
Yep.
So again, we don't necessarily have a recommendation, but sometimes when we're looking at our ordinance, it becomes difficult to advise people who genuinely want to do the right thing, and whether they need to license their business, and then correspondingly, whether they need to report B&O tax on that. And sometimes we can guide them a little bit. Well, what's, do your gross receipts meet the threshold? And then that answers that question. But for people that are legitimately trying to do the right things, I guess one of the questions we might have is, do we need to provide a little bit more definition for what constitutes a business when it particularly comes to this rental versus use?
Mike?
Quick question. Just want to make sure I understand all that. So if it's a business within a business, and that second business is the lease agreement, what you're saying is there's that individual, excuse me, let me start over. Somebody owns a building that they conduct normal business out of that has space. They decide to lease that additional space to another business. They're required to pay B&O tax on that lease venture as long as it exceeds $20,000 in gross receipts a year. Is that how I'm understanding it? Or
The
they're not?
building owner,
Building owner, yes.
right? The people who lease space in there are merely having a license of use.
Right.
For the law, correct?
Okay. So the building owner would pay B&O on that lease venture with the other business owner.
If it's over, correct.
And then that other business owner would pay B&O for their business internally there if it exceeds $20,000 in gross receipts annually.
I like things easy, so my mind is not clicking on this, because doesn't the building owner pay property taxes? That would be, okay, so then the person in the building licensed to do a business, wouldn't he pay the B&O tax?
if over the threshold,
Mhm.
correct.
That'd be easier.
Well, but I guess one thing I heard you say is the property tax, and that's a separate tax.
Right, right. I'm just thinking that the person who owns the building would be paying property taxes. The person in the building that's doing a business would pay the B and O tax. So,
Right. I think one of the questions that came to us from a couple of citizens who asked, who were property owners, they felt that it was a bit of double taxation, if I'm capturing that right, because they felt like, well, I'm leasing it to the person, I'm paying B and O on that, and then they're paying B and O on what they make. And so what we're trying to distinguish is, but it's two separate ventures.
Two businesses.
Business.
It's two
Business
separate
and occupation, it's not business or occupation.
Right.
Right.
Right, and so we may have enough definition, but I think having a clear understanding of your direction and where you want us to go is part of to make sure we're following what is intended with the code is part of our reason for bringing.
And another point of confusion, I think Mike has it on here at some point, is the definition of a business. You know.
Yeah.
That's how it's defined. It's basically any, you have it.
Anything.
Yeah,
It was in there.
yeah, it's, yeah, it's in there, but basically it's anytime an individual in our organization does something that generates a profit, anything. And that's one of the questions that was brought up that we're trying to answer and get clarity from policy direction from council. Where do we want to go? You know,
That would apply to nonprofits as well.
but and nonprofits would have to do that, although they are exempt from B and O. But they do have to get a business license, yes.
And that's the definition I think
Yeah.
that you were.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Engaging in business. So that's basically anything. I mean, under this definition, if I don't know if anybody uses Craigslist anymore, but if I sold a television on Craigslist for $40, I'm engaging in business, you know, so.
But B and O on our B and O report, it said on the line, it says retail sales
Sure.
or manufacturing sales.
Mhm.
I don't think it says rent or lease.
No, I know. That's why we're having an issue with this, because if you rent a bare piece of land for a flea market, right? Then does that rent on that piece of property become subject to a business license and a B&O tax? If they meet the threshold, right? Where the people selling at the flea market would obviously have to get, a business license if it's a reoccurring thing and if they meet the threshold, but the underlying property owner or the building owner or the landlord, is that also a separate business? And what we're looking for clarity surrounding is what's that threshold?
Another, go ahead.
farmer's market, that would be the same as a flea market.
Sure.
Except the farmers that bring in food and
Right,
et cetera are exempt. They
Right.
don't pay.
right.
And essentially, when it comes to B and O tax, when we hear about this, B and O is in lieu of state does not have an income tax in Washington
Right.
state. So in order to pay for the services that we provide to business and to support business, that's the purpose of B and O, right? I mean, so again, if it's an income earning thing over $20,000, then B and O would apply to whoever the owner of that is, correct?
And this particular one, it's B&O. I mean, there's a threshold, business and occupation taxes. There's a threshold of gross receipts that you have to meet before you pay that.
Right.
But if you're engaged in business, you have to have a business license. So, theoretically, taking it to the extreme again,
Yeah, business license.
yeah, if you're selling something on Craigslist or whatever the newer ones are, you would theoretically be required to have a business license. Now, are people going to do that? Probably not, but that's where we're searching for clarity here on how we want to approach this.
Have you looked at other cities?
It's in here.
And I think one of the questions that comes to us in finance or to the city manager's office is, of course, that equity. How are you making sure everyone has one? And that's, I'll just be frank with you, and I think this happens from what I ascertain in other cities. To a certain extent, if you don't have the staffing or the ability to enforce it, you know, we are relying on people to report that honestly, and that's really what we have. If we know of some sort of infraction, we haven't talked about it internally, how we would handle that. Would we use code enforcement? What exactly we do? But that's brought up, and I think many cities struggle with that, even the larger ones that might have an auditing arm to their B&O tax division. It's tough because even if you're going to go out and question, well, are you filing the right amount of B&O tax? You've got to look at somebody's taxes, right? To see what's filed, and that's simply not able to be done for most cities with staffing. So but those were the questions that were brought to us. Really, I think I did put some examples. We talked about business licenses, really, who has to have one. I think if you look at our list, and we can see the list of who has a business license, it's anyone who does business in Shelton. So we have a number of registered users who don't have a Shelton business address but are doing business. So, you know, I'm confident that the majority of people, I say that I'm confident, I'm fairly confident the majority of people engaging in business are trying to do the right thing and license.
And Mike, have we seen an increase in the business licenses within the city since the streamlined business license went into effect statewide? Because I know that was what, 2018-19. There was that push from AWC to kind of beat the state to a solution for this, because I'll tell you, even at the chamber, one of the challenges we have is people will come in and say, I signed for my business license with the state. What do you mean I need a separate one for the city? And so now that all being integrated through a single source, have we seen an uptick in the number of business licenses within the city, or is that something we know?
Do you know, Terry, anecdotally, if we have?
We haven't studied that. Yeah.
I mean, I will tell you that when you look at the list, it's pretty impressive, the number of businesses that are registered that have outside of Shelton, because we can sort it, primary address. So I feel like that streamlined effect has probably made it easier, I would assume, because you're doing it all in one place, right? And it makes it more convenient.
Sure.
Now, some of those businesses, if they're a plumber or, you know, some of the big box stores that are doing business in Shelton, they're having to register in multiple localities, municipalities. So I'm assuming that helps everybody out by doing that. I would assume. We did look at some language in a couple of other communities surrounding the whole aspect of rentals. That's where we define in our code that all businesses are subject to B&O tax unless exempted, and that gross receipts amount. So this is an example from the city of Longview. They basically use the same language with the that's in that code that was sent to everyone, kind of like we do. They defined it a little bit more, owning, renting, leasing, using, or maintaining an office, place of business, or other establishment. That's pretty close to ours, but I don't think it defines any better what, you know, if you're in that rent owner lessee kind of situation. The next example is Port Townsend, where they define a business means a professional trade, occupation, or activity carried on for a livelihood or engaged in with the object of gain, benefit, or advantage to the participant or to another person or class directly or indirectly for profit. So we looked at that with, does that give any more definition to what that means to be a business? I don't know, it's just worded a little bit differently. It seemed like it was something to provide as just kind of another point to look at. I don't know that it makes it any more clear. And then this is one from the city of Fife where they define business. I highlighted the last sentence because they add that the term business shall include the letting for rent or lease for residential occupancy 4 or more residential dwelling units within the city. And so that, I guess, to us made a little bit of a distinction that if you're owning 4 or more buildings, that seems like a business to them in their definition. Whereas if you own a couple of houses for rent, that's not. So I guess that's how they went about defining that for a little bit more clarity. Because that's one of the things we've talked about. Well, then if you own a house and you rent it, that's a business. But this, I think, defines it a little bit more clearly.
Under our current language, if you own one single family home, or you own 2, you live in one, you rent the other, the rental is a business. And that's where we're trying to get, we're trying to kind of narrow this down so we can provide clarity to the citizens and the property owners in the city. Because when we get questions like this, it's a struggle to answer.
So can I get something clear again? I think Joe brought it up. So let's say there's a business and then he's got a piece of property hooked to it.
Mhm.
But he lets food trucks come and sit on that. So he pays B&O on his business. And then the person with the food truck pays the B&O on their business?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well,
And in
if,
theory, if the food truck is paying the property owner to
That's-
be
yeah.
at that space, the property owner would also pay B&O on that revenue.
Okay,
If it's
All
more
right.
than 20,000.
If it's over the threshold of 20,000.
okay, all right, thank you.
I think that covers most of what we wanted with both the business license concept and then that whole idea of then when does the B&O tax come into play? And I think for the most part, the B&O tax is pretty clear with the thresholds. It's just what constitutes the business so that people really understand. Because for the most part, I really do think that owners want to do the right thing. We struggle sometimes with that definition, as Jeff said. In what, because cases can be unique. And so to try to distinguish for folks, and that's where, when this came up, we thought, well, we need to take it to council in the form of a study session to really ask the question.
How do you let the owners, like the example I gave? What if they're not clear on that, or they don't know that that's, if they're getting some revenue off that food truck, how do they know they have to pay B&O on that too?
Well, through the business,
There a letter or instructions or something along that line?
through the business licensing letter.
Mhm.
Registration, then that triggers a letter, but it's still up to the person to report, right? I
Right,
mean,
okay.
well, and the other struggle
Yeah.
too is how are we going to people that rent out, like you mentioned, food truck, people that rent out a space for their food truck for certain hours a day. How is the property owner, not the food truck owner? How is the property owner going to know that they, under our current language, should have a business license for that? And is that something that we want to continue? Whether they meet the threshold for B&O or not, that's kind of a separate, piece. But if you're, renting out a 10 by 20 rectangle of land for a food truck from your acre parcel, and you allow it to sit there for 6 hours a day, whatever it is. You're probably from that lease, and I don't know, but probably not going to meet the threshold to pay B&O tax, but still should have a business license under our current language.
And I know in preparing for this presentation, I was asking our finance staff to work with this, well, tell me if this, because I was thinking of apartment complexes, if this apartment complex pays, can you, and they're like, well, tell me the name of it or who owns it, because that's the other thing we struggle with is if we don't know the owner or we can't even look up for sure what's happening. So we have some gaps sometimes with how much information we can get. Now, if we have the time, of course, we can go on the county website, we can look up the address and see who the registered owner is and try to track it that way. But that takes a lot of time that we don't have a dedicated staff person to necessarily do that. So when we think about, I know, Mayor, you were asking this yesterday, you know, will the software do that? It won't do it automatically. It would take, you know, in that particular case, it would take some research by staff to then say, okay, we don't see a business license for this owner. Let's send a letter, but that's not something, you know, that's necessarily feasible. And
So what do you need to do that then?
what would we need?
I guess that's maybe what we would like to know. B&O is the third largest revenue generating source in the city, and I would recommend that we fund what is needed to appropriately deal with
I mean, I guess one thing that occurs to me is I don't know that I don't know for certain how much or that we're under collecting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean,
It's an assumption that we are, but in my view, I think the first part is investing in the new B&O software that council invested in last year with the adoption of the budget. The other part is to do that tracking where you search the property records for the registered owner and then determine whether they have a business license or not. That's a pretty much full-time dedicated person, another position in finance.
I mean, and how do you know it's a rental home and not a personal home? This sounds just.
Yeah.
Very complicated.
It is, and
The
that's
rentals, that is.
for sure. And that too would require that same person because we do have the ability to track that. It's just having the staff available to do it because of the utility billing.
I mean, the current B&O tax that we send out a statement to every single business with a business license in the city of Shelton. I've received them myself.
Right.
And then I fill them out. If I don't fill it out, we should know that I didn't fill it out. I
Yes.
mean, hopefully that new software is going
And
to tell you
that-
that.
right, and that would,
Okay.
I do agree, that will allow us to trigger a letter that's more, I think, and we don't have it all the way, so I don't want to overcommit
Yeah.
staff. But I do think that has the promise of being able to do that. But at the end of the day, we do find ourselves, even if we track down an address, a little bit at their mercy to do the right thing. We can send letters, but we haven't necessarily decided as a staff, are we going to then, if they don't respond, send code enforcement? What happens next? So I think that's really where the staff have looked to me like, well, what do you want us to do if we do track it down? And they aren't.
Right.
You know,
Okay.
but business owners, I think you would agree, want a certain sense of fairness in the system that we're holding everybody to the same
Yep.
expectation.
Jeff said, how underserved are we? How many, and I think if we miss one person, we're underserved.
Yeah, it's all a component. The new software will help substantially, but it won't ensure that businesses that are operating actually have a business license.
I also have to assume too, this position, the collection aspect of it and all that is, that's very important, but I also gotta believe we have a check and balance on that to ensure that we're actually collecting an appropriate amount and not over collecting potentially in some situations, right? Because from a financial aspect, we should probably make sure that cash that we're depositing in the bank makes sense. And not just depositing. So again, I come back to, let's try to make an employee in on the budget for 2024, if that's what we need. We need an FTE in finance or something.
Yeah, and we have had those discussions about the 2024 budget. Everybody's aware of that. And finance is fully funded by the general fund.
Yeah,
So,
Understand?
so I just wanted to make sure that everybody was aware.
I think that we need to get this software up and running and see how it works and make sure we're getting in what we're sending out
Mhm.
first. I think that we're getting way ahead of ourselves with this apartment or somebody's second home. And I think that's gonna just get way confusing. I think that's even more than one person. Because you can have one person in the office and one person on the
Potentially.
street, so, and we're not ready for that. I mean, we're trying to fund police and sewers and.
Well, I do agree with you on that. I also think that, to Mike's point, the auditing aspect of it, I don't know that we're ready for, but I do think we should be prepared to answer those questions if someone does come in and say, is this something that I need to do?
Yeah, the
What
business
does that
license
look
side,
like?
of it, yeah.
Right, so from the licensing side of things, getting some clarification and kind of fleshing that out, I think is something we need to take some time to delve into.
Well, I'd like to see other cities, more cities and how they're handling stuff like that, business license and rentals.
And maybe a report, what, it sounds like you'd be interested, once we get the software up and running, kind of what. It feels like it would be beneficial to know what it can do, what kinds of follow-up we can have, and talk maybe about that.
Yeah.
Before we look at big changes, does
Yeah.
that sound like good direction?
I've been asking for a report for a long time.
Yeah,
On
well,
the
some,
software?
No,
Or-
on.
some of the stuff is, we have to sign an acknowledgement from the state that we will not share with anybody. So that's part of it, but we can schedule another study session after we've gathered the information that council's requested tonight. Kind of flesh this out a little bit more. It's a complex topic, and I think that it's important for us to be able to answer all of your questions before you come to a policy direction.
Can I ask when the $20,000 standard of when it becomes a business that needs to be taxed, when was that established?
That I'm not sure, but we can get the answer for you on
And
that.
could we adjust for inflation or, like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, I don't know what's fair.
It's been like 20 years. I've
Yeah.
been doing this. so-
We can look at the date that ordinance was passed and give that to you.
Cause I know most businesses in Shelton are, small cottage businesses that are
Right.
probably under 20.
Mhm.
But when you're trying to like make a little extra money for inflation, maybe we can have 24,000 and,
Yeah.
so at least you're making $2,000 a month. I don't know.
There's also been some conversation about, how BNO, in fairness, regards to your gross receipts versus your net receipts. If you have a business that's highly expensive to run, are you paying on the amount that you're putting out, or or is it just on that net figure? And so that's a question we get often at the chamber, is like, what am I reporting on here? So again,
It
having
is
some
gross.
clarity, correct,
Yeah.
but having some clarity in that process. and-
Okay.
Right.
What's
You're
that?
reporting on revenue,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
Not on your expenditure.
Yeah,
Not on
retail-
profit,
retail
yeah.
sales, correct.
Retail
Right.
sales.
Gross revenue, it doesn't include gasoline.
Right.
Gasoline is exempt, but
So like the utility bill.
yes.
And gross receipts. That's the
No,
expenditure, right?
no, there's no expenditures. There's no
Yeah,
write-offs.
profit.
It's
It's
just
just
straight gross
flat
receipts.
rate.
If I did $100,000 inside in
Yeah.
sales in my store, I
And
pay.
We can do.
0.1 on that.
Yeah, we can do the legislative history on the adoption of that ordinance and when it was adopted and kind of bring you back those answers. Yeah, so
Thanks.
we'll get that scheduled for May, June.
We will.
Is there a new date for
Have
businesses
some
that are-
royalty.
the businesses that are licensed?
Mhm.
Is there like a median gross revenue? What
I'm sure there is. I'm not sure if that's
has
something
it been
the
increasing or decreasing?
Department of Revenue wants to share or not, but we can find out.
I mean,
If it's something we can share, then we will.
Any other questions for Mike? No,
It's a good topic. Thanks for getting it going.
all right.
Thank you.
Does the council have any new items for discussion?
I do.
Right.
Are we going to go forward with our trees up for a road? What's going on with those?
The trees on Western, on all the way down. We are, the budget number that was brought back to us from the arborist and from the designer was a little difficult to swallow. So not yet, but that is definitely on the work plan.
I have a business, a person that owns a business on Railroad and he's needing to get his tree trimmed up so he can paint his building.
Okay,
He's just wondering if we're gonna,
yeah, and he can call us. We're happy to go out and do that, or report the issue on our app.
okay.
Any other items? At this time, I'd like to invite the council to embarrass Jeff a little bit. This is his last study session. He's been with us just a little bit over 4 years. So who would like to start?
Roast him. Roast him, roast him.
Just the roast.
The roast
This is-
Jeff on the record. Jeff, go ahead.
I just want to say, since I've come on the council. Thank you for welcoming me. Thank you for giving me the truth, even if it was hard to swallow. Thank you for your professionalism. Thank you for the standard you've set and the loyalty that you've earned. And I just want to say respect.
Thank you. I can take it.
I won't say anything rude or mean. But thank you for taking the city on. And getting it straightened out. We hope we can keep on going.
We know we're not either.
Yeah, we know where you're gonna be and we know where you live. Anyway,
Do we know where you live?
Thank you.
Do you live in the city limits?
um,
I just want to say, those of us who've been on council since 2018 had the pleasure of seeing you on board with the city and really take on a huge challenge, not only in moving to the new form of government, but also tackling some significant challenges with our financial position, the staffing levels, and really creating a culture that is moving us forward. And I can't thank you enough for continuing to have candid conversations and being willing to look for innovative solutions and take the brunt of a lot of feedback, whether you wanted to or not, and always being willing to have that open ear. It's something that I'm really hopeful will continue. And I know that with Mark coming on, I have no doubt that will be the next phase as well. But I just want to thank you personally for everything you've done for the council and for the city, and hope you have a really wonderful next chapter in city management.
Thank you.
So just want to say thanks for choosing us back in 2018. We were going through that process and it was looking pretty bleak. But this guy from Ridgefield, fastest growing city in Western Washington, decided to choose Shelton to start his city manager career. I'm glad you did. You did some tremendous things and a lot of things that needed immediate attention, media firefighting. And you did that very, very well. I've appreciated the strategy discussions and back and forth and on that. And yeah, it's gonna be tough to replace you exactly. But we know we're in good hands with Mark, and you've done a great job establishing a leadership team. I think out of anything, I think that's probably the biggest and most significant thing that you've done in your tenure here, because now yeah, we're on the right track. We just now have to execute and keep the ball moving. And yeah, I think Shelton's on a good trajectory. We just got to keep it going that way. And yeah, appreciated everything you did, and you're gonna do just fine up there and wherever that is, Mountain Lake Terrace or someplace.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
It has been an absolute pleasure working with you, Jeff. I've learned a lot from you, and we've not always agreed, but you have a way of convincing me sometimes that you're right and I'm wrong. But I have 4 pages of stuff that you've done here, but we know what you've done. Just because it didn't hit Shelton Talks or Mason County Talks doesn't mean that we don't know. And we're real appreciative of you coming in, like Joe said. Coming here, you gonna read those?
It's got 4 pages.
But I absolutely loved working with you, and Mountain Lake Terrace is gonna be lucky to have you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
You gonna read some of those?
Sauce.
be careful, when he needed to be a little more careful when he said his phone is available at all times.
He answers his phone, and if he does not answer his phone, it's probably not 10 minutes later, anytime day or night.
Yeah,
You know
it
that
was
he will
great.
answer the phone, and or if we don't get a phone call in the middle of the night with some emergency that he's letting us know about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't get a phone call and not know how to answer it.
I'm
And-
sure Mayor Dorsey there in the back remembers telling everybody at council that I better not be watching the council meeting from Hawaii, and I was. I will admit I watched that, but it's important to be involved and be available. So thanks.
All
Appreciate
right.
you.
So we're not gonna let you get away without a couple embarrassments. Everybody know Jeff likes extra bubble gum, like a box a month.
Absolutely.
He does. And M&M peanuts, I
Yep.
understand that.
Donna takes care of that for me.
So we had to get you a cake. So we have a cake for you.
Awesome.
I think we're gonna get it.
Is it a peanut bubblegum cake? Cause that'd be
Uh,
great.
it's pink chocolate, but I did a strawberry and lemon.
Okay,
I don't know how that happened. but
that,
was my-
that works fine too.
And we got. stuff for everybody.
All mine, right? Oh,
Take that.
that's great.
What does it say?
It's just has a picture of the
But
extra
you're
bubble
like,
gum on it.
You have to have cake and water and sodas and.
Extra.
Fairness, I do want to adjourn the meeting and then we'll.
Yeah. Thank you.
and then we'll-
Oh, yeah.
We gotta reach.
Priority.